Now, this is all where the source of the modern conflict over the 4 islands claimed by both sides begins. Let's start off with Japan's perspective. Japan cites the ambiguity of the language used in various World War II-era documents and statements as backing up their rightful claims to the islands. Specifically, the Cairo Declaration of 1943 made by the Allies, which reads, verbatim, "Japan shall be stripped of all the islands in the Pacific which she has seized or occupied since the beginning of the First World War in 1914. As well as this quote, "Japan will also be expelled from all other territories which she has taken by violence and greed." Japan's legal team would like to point out that the Kuril Islands specifically are not covered by the demands of this declaration, seeing as how Japan peacefully negotiated their control from Russia in 1875, before the First World War, and even further back settled the 4 islands under dispute back in the 1855 Shimoda Treaty with Russia. These 4 islands were never taken by violence and greed, and should therefore have never been taken from Japan. Further, the Potsdam Declaration made by the Allies later on in 1945 as the war was concluding reads under Section 8 that Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine, which the Japanese government is keen to point out does not address the issue of the 4 disputed minor islands directly. Japan further points out that the disputed islands had been a part of Tokugawa-era Japan since 1855, before the era of the empire, and had never been claimed by or belonged to Russia until they conquered them by force in the closing days of the Second World War. And on that point, the Japanese further point out that the Soviet Union's declaration of war in 1945 was in violation of the previously signed defense pact between both nations that was legally supposed to be in force until 1946, and as such, the Soviet invasion and occupation was illegal. Finally, Japan signed the San Francisco Treaty in 1951, which ended the legal state of war between themselves and the Western Allies. Article 2C of this treaty made Japan renounce all rights to the Kuril Islands, but the treaty also never recognized Soviet sovereignty over them, and the Japanese insist that the islands of Eterofu, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and Habamai are not geographically a part of the Kuril Islands, and thus are not a part of this agreement. And further, neither the Soviet Union nor Russia have ever signed the San Francisco Treaty anyway. Alright, now let's move on to Russia's viewpoint. Russia argues that, first of all, the disputed islands are in fact geographically a part of the Kuril Island chain, and that the Japanese government's assertion that they are not is simply a tactic used to enhance their own claim, and this assertion is not supported by any basic geography or history. Second of all, Russia cites the Yalta Agreement of 1945, in which the Western Allies explicitly promised the Soviet Union control of the Kuril Islands in exchange for the Soviets declaring war on Japan, which the Russians argue geographically includes the 4 disputed islands. However, Japan's legal team is quick to point out that they were never a party to the Yalta Agreement, and never agreed to or signed any of its terms. Further, from Russia's perspective, there are the people who actually live within the disputed islands today. The 4 islands are now home to roughly 19,000 people, the overwhelming majority of whom are ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, who overwhelmingly support remaining a part of Russia, shown in poll after poll. This is, of course, however, after the Soviets forcefully deported the entirety of the ethnic Japanese population from the islands following the end of the Second World War, and replaced them with ethnic Slavs. And of course, Russia controls the islands today, and has controlled them for nearly 80 years now, since their invasion in 1945. So, obviously, the question over who should rightfully control them is pretty legally complicated, and the decades of negotiations over this very question have been pretty understandably stalled, as neither side has ever been willing to give much ground. In 1956, the Soviets did offer the Japanese the 2 smaller islands of Habamai and Shikotan in exchange for their recognition of Russian control over the 2 larger islands and a formal peace treaty ending World War II between them. But Japan refused and insisted on having the 2 larger islands returned as well, and they've been refusing for decades ever since because the Soviets and later the Russians have just kept making the same offer over and over again. As late as 2006, Vladimir Putin was still offering Japan the return of Habamai and Shikotan and a formal peace treaty if only Japan would renounce their claims over the two larger islands. But Japan still refused and has kept insisting that all of the islands are theirs. And of course today, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Japanese government has upped their rhetoric of claims, while Russia has deployed more military and anti-air assets to them in response. Internationally, the United States and European Union each recognize all four of the islands as rightful Japanese territory that is currently under Russian occupation, while China recognizes them as a core integral territory of Russia, and the reasons why extend far beyond the legal and historical claims. Because, of course, the islands hold immense strategic value to whoever ends up actually controlling them. The Kuril Islands themselves are a vital territory to control from the perspective of Moscow, because of the Russian Pacific Fleet based near Vladivostok, which includes nuclear missile-armed submarines that are a core component of Russia's nuclear deterrent. The only possible paths that the fleet can take out into the greater Pacific Ocean are through either the narrow Korea, Tsushima, Kanmon, and Tsugaru Straits, all of which lead directly through US Allied-controlled choke points on either side, or alternatively through the Kuril Islands, which they actually have control over and can therefore move across freely and relatively undetected. But there's a huge problem with these islands during the winter when the straits between them largely freeze over with sea ice and hamper the ability for ships to travel through. The northern islands in the chain remain frozen for an average of 60 days longer than those in the south do. So if the four southern disputed islands were ever returned back to Japan, it would not only extend Japanese and therefore American influence deeper into the Kurils, but it would only leave Russia with the northern islands to pass their Pacific Fleet through, which is frozen for a significantly longer amount of the year, and would further restrict Russia's naval capabilities in the area. Further, since the United States already has tens of thousands of troops deployed to Japan across nearly 24 bases, it wouldn't be inconceivable that were the disputed islands ever returned to Japan, the United States would then construct their own air bases there that could threaten Russia's ability to freely move naval assets through the remaining Kuril Islands even during the summer, and thus the United States would have effectively secured the encirclement and containment of the Russian Pacific Fleet within the Sea of Okhotsk and Sea of Japan. And then, to make matters even worse from Moscow's perspective, any surrendering of supposedly occupied territory in the east to Japan would set a dangerous legal precedent for themselves over on the other side of Eurasia in Ukraine, where the Crimean Peninsula is claimed by Ukraine and nearly the rest of the world as being rightful Ukrainian territory currently under Russian occupation, very similarly to how Japan and the United States view the disputed islands in the Pacific. And there's also the potential resources. While it's unclear at the moment, there is significant speculation that the area around them could be rich in oil and gas reserves, especially when considering that some of the largest reserves ever discovered in the world are very nearby offshore of northeastern Sakhalin. Were similar reserves to ever be discovered within the waters around the Kurils and the disputed islands, it would dramatically change the calculus on both sides, especially considering the huge changes in exclusive economic zone borders that would happen were the islands to be given back to Japan. So, for all of these reasons, Moscow is highly unlikely to ever consider giving the islands back to Japan. And in fact, it's now illegal to do so following recent changes made to the Russian constitution that have made it illegal for the state to ever give up any of its territory to another power, which was specifically written in with the disputed islands and Crimea both in mind. And now, following the sanctions and the heightened rhetoric coming from Tokyo, Moscow has fully withdrawn from all peace agreement talks and has once again begun to militarize the islands as a show of force to the world. Final peace between Japan and Russia has ultimately proven to be elusive, and the question of who should rightfully control the four islands seems like it will remain open for the foreseeable future.